So this is a model that is built on two assumptions, and with those two assumptions we can get some interesting insights about the scope for regulation to restrict choice but actually make people better off in the process. Typically in economics, we think restrictions of choice are not welfare improving. So it's a pretty novel little model that will give you that counterintuitive result that you can impose restrictions on people, limit their choices, and make them better off. We'll do this particularly in the context of child labor regulation. We want to extract from the interaction of child and adult labor a bit by assuming that adult labor is always inelastic. So think of a household as consisting of one child and then one adult. The adult always works. The child only works when wages are below subsistence. So if I were to draw total household effective labor supply, we'd have regardless of the wages, adults are always going to work. And then when wages hit subsistence, anytime below that, then the household will choose to have the child work. So let's just draw this down. So we have kind of A to B is when there are only the adult working, and we'll say there's just one adult per household. And then from C to D, when wages get below subsistence, then the family will choose to have the child work. Child and adult do the same work, but children so they're perfect substitutes, but children are a little less productive. So one child is equivalent to A, where A is less than one adult worker. So the total household labor supply when wages are below subsistence is 1 plus A, the amount that children work. Ultimately, this is going to be a model where we're putting supply and demand together to get wages determined. That means we need to leave the household and go to the market. So what we'll do is we'll add up all of the N households to get market labor supply from this individual labor supply problem we've pictured on this page. All right. Each household has that funny step labor supply function where they're either supplying 1 or 1 plus A. Now, when we add up all those households, we then wind up with that similar shape, but with this now kind of continuity in the middle of possible labor supplies, where we have A, B, C, D defining effective market. And the total amount of employment available is N when kids aren't working, but when equilibrium wages are below subsistence, we wind up with N plus A times N for the total effective labor supply in the market. Now, to figure out wages, let's add in labor demand. We'll begin with one simple schedule up here. So we have, inelastic adult labor supply, our typical downward sloping labor demand, meaning as wages are lower, firms want to use more, and then we wind up with some equilibrium wage, this instance of W star, where given high labor demand, only adults work, wages are W star above S, so no children then ends up needing to work. We can think of a different, similarly simple equilibrium with an alternative labor demand schedule. We'll call our high labor demand A, this is our low labor demand B. Oh, maybe I don't want to do that because I already have a B, so we'll call this alpha and beta. Now, in the low labor demand situation, equilibrium wages are going to be so low that households will be below subsistence, and so all children will work, and you'll wind up with a very low wage beta in equilibrium and all kids working. Okay, so high labor demand, low labor demand. High labor demand, wages are high, all kids are out of the labor force. Low labor demand, all kids are working. The really interesting case here is when labor demand intersects labor supply in 3 spots. We'll call this E0, E1, and E2. Notice in this state, two equilibria are stable, E0 and E2. If I'm at E0, wages are above subsistence, so households wouldn't want their kids to work, and as a result, markets clear with only adults working. And if I'm at E2, wages are below subsistence, though given this labor demand and labor supply, it would be possible to have an equilibrium of high wage and no child employment. We're at E2, wages are low, all kids are working, so markets are again clearing and there's no way to get out of that equilibrium. Now E1, notice if wages are at subsistence, the demand for labor is at E1, but the supply is at point C, and so there'll be more people on offer wanting to work at the subsistence wage than there are jobs, and so people will bid down wages till we get down to that stable E2. So E1 isn't a stable equilibrium. We can wind up at E2 or E0. Now notice, though, we have a setting here of multiple equilibria. Both are possible given the labor demand and labor supply. One is a better equilibrium. Wages are high, families don't send their kids to work. E2, wages are low, families send their kids to work. So what could we do? Well, regulation could come about. Ban kids from working. What's that going to do? Well, that then truncates labor supply. An effective ban means then labor supply just becomes this line here, meaning we would then have equilibrium E0. So regulation, despite not changing any of the other aspects of the model, can move an economy from an equilibrium with child labor to an equilibrium without child labor if it's enforced. And that new equilibrium of no child labor would be stable because wages are high, so families don't want their kids to work. So that's an example where you can ban a market and make everyone better off. This is a fun little model you can play around with. You can imagine, changing people's perceptions of subsistence, so that will move the flat portion of the labor supply curve around. You could imagine shocks to labor demand that will either increase labor demand or lower labor demand. And so there's a lot of little ways you can play with this model to both see what the implication of changes in perceptions of subsistence, cost of subsistence, or labor demand would have for child labor and for the arguments for regulation of labor.